problem you're familiar with, even if you don't know that you're familiar with. I'll give you an example. All right, if I take a coin out of my pocket, if I flip a quarter in the air, what are the odds that it lands on heads? Also, Scout's Honor, I don't ask any good trick questions or anything like that. About 50-50, right? Let's say I do that. I flip it, it lands on heads. What? And I flip it, it lands on heads 6 times in a row. What are the odds the next time I flip it that it lands on heads? It's still 50-50. Exactly. Same kind of thing with you go to a casino. You know, you spin the roulette wheel, it could land on black 10 times in a row, 15 times in a row. And the odds the next time, it's still just about 50-50. The casino puts on those green spaces so they get a little tiny advantage. It's that like 1% edge that's how you make money at a casino, right? But there can be, some flaws in scientific reasoning. That you observe something. That's the idea behind science: is you set up a set of conditions, you observe something, and every time something happens one way, you say, okay, now we know in these conditions this is X will happen. Well, Hume wrote, like, how do you logically know that? Just because something has always happened one way in the past, what truly logical reason do you have to believe that it will continue to happen that way every single time you do it? Just because a coin lands on its head side 30 times in a row doesn't mean that the next time it will, right? Another good way to look at it is, there have been billions of people who have lived here on Earth, and billions of people have died. But every single time anyone has ever died, it hasn't been me. So, what logical reason do I have to believe that I will ever die, right? You can see there's maybe some issues with that kind of thinking. So, what Hume said, he said, no amount of observations of white swans can allow the inference that all swans are white, but the observation of a single black swan is sufficient to refute that conclusion. What he meant was that in Europe, they had white swans. And if you have to define what is a swan, well, it's got wings, it's got the long neck, it lives in water. And for a very long time, they were white. That was just what color swans were, just like a zebra has stripes and a leopard has spots, right? And that's part of what makes that animal that animal. Well, that was true until they went to Australia and they discovered a black swan. So all of a sudden, all it takes is a single black swan to disprove that notion that all swans are white, right? So this is what we want to think about when we think about cryptids. I like this. So live each day like there's truly no rational reason to believe there will be another. Hume having fun on the roller coaster. But I was philosophy undergrad. In my undergrad, I was a philosophy major. And this kind of came up. This is what really got me hooked onto this cryptid topic. One day we were talking about some problem, and I mentioned something about a narwhal to my professor. He said, like, oh, what about a pink narwhal? And he's like, oh, interesting. What's the truth value of that statement about a fictitious creature, something made up? And I said, Professor, narwhals are real. He's like, they are? I thought those were made up. I didn't realize that was a real animal. I said, yeah, they're definitely real. So to him, the narwhal was a cryptid. So what is a cryptid? So a cryptid fits in this really interesting niche between mythology, pop culture, biology, all of these things up together. So there's a great big list of cryptids. Every country, every part of the world has different cryptids. Some are super famous. Some are super, hyper local. If we think about some of the most famous cryptids in the world, there are things like Nessie, right? Loch Ness Monster. There are things like the chupacabra, right? The Mexican goat eater. There have been some, pictures. There's a picture someone caught of a chupacabra. There's a digital camera. I've always kind of asked, even as we've entered the digital age, a lot of the pictures of cryptids tend to be blurry. And I wonder if maybe just the creatures themselves are blurry, which would explain a lot. But you look at something like this, and you also look at a picture of a coyote with mange, and you're like, oh, maybe that does have an explanation. I can see one. There are some cryptids, like Michigan has its own set of cryptids, like Michigan Dog Man, right? So there's actually a picture, believe it or not, of the Michigan Dog Man, this almost werewolf-like creature that many people have seen late at night. And buckle up, here's a photo of the Dog Man. Now, I know he does have all of 15 pixels, but again, maybe the Dog Man's just blurry, right? There are some like the Loveland Frog. Loveland, Ohio has a 3-foot tall frog man that many people have attested to seeing, late at night. There's him next to a guardrail and next to a person for scale. And in fact, they've fully embraced the frog man, and they have now a festival. It's the Loveland Frogman Festival. And it's their little summer fun weekend dedicated to their cryptid. There are some cryptids that are maybe, less lovable. Things like lots of myths about the Mothman that has come up in places like New Jersey, or even Slender Man. That's something that's fully born out of the internet culture. This started as like a 4chan post and became wildly popular from there. But there's all sorts. So it's a huge range when it comes to cryptids. So I think you'll see what I'm going to do with some of this. But I want to give you one more chance because to talk about skepticism. There's a lot of people who are either hardcore skeptics and say this is all made up, or there are people who are, they go on a Bigfoot hunt themselves, every single, fall. And there's, sometimes people in between. And I've got something for everybody, I think, in this talk. And so what I want to set out is an idea about science. We think about science and there's always, they say that science is settled, right? Well, science is actually never settled. That's kind of the part and point of science, is that as new information becomes available, it can change. I want to give you a great example of that. This is Alfred Wegener. He was a German. He was a polar explorer who lived right around the turn of the 20th century. He did a number of different things. He was a geologist, explored up in the Arctic, and he came up with an idea around the turn of the 20th century that was so outlandish in his profession that he was laughed out of the field. Like, he couldn't present at conferences. Other scientists said, that's such a loony idea, get out of here. We're not going to listen or take you seriously. And what he had thought of, he was putting together a puzzle one day of the world, and he noticed that his puzzle piece of Africa and his puzzle piece of South America looked like they fit together. He said, that's kind of weird, right? And so he took this idea pretty seriously, and he suggested the idea that the continents move around. And it might take millions of years. But he said, it looks like Africa and South America must have been together at one point. And so what he would suggest was what would become the continental plate theory of how kind of the world works. We think of the world as this solid ball, but really it's like a big eggshell. It's cracked. And it's all kind of moving around a little bit, but only, maybe a centimeter or two a year. It doesn't move very fast. But there's all sorts of, the more they looked into this later on, the more proof they found. There are things like, the American Appalachian Mountains are the same mountains as the Highlands in Scotland, because they used to be right next to each other. They looked and saw how all of these pieces, fit together into one giant continent at one time, millions and millions of years ago. They even found different animals where they would find fossil evidence of an animal in South America and Africa and India. And they say, how can that be? Because those are really far apart today, but at one time they were all right next to each other. And so that tells you just how much science can change. Continental plate theory is something that I first learned about when I was in, I don't know, 5th grade earth science, maybe 6th grade earth science. I was sitting there, though. That's a topic they teach elementary school students today. And less than 100 years before, it was an idea so radical, it got you laughed out of the field. So take that that's the grain of salt I want everyone to have when they say, wow, Bigfoot's ridiculous. Loch Ness Monster, ridiculous. Less than a century from the time that this was ridiculous, this is now basic stuff they teach in elementary school. I never really liked science a whole lot in elementary school. I was always a history guy. I did well enough in class, but this was something I said, like, okay, I get it. This is boring. I'm not interested by continents barely bumping around on Earth. So you could go from a radical idea to something that's just boring for some elementary school students, right? So that's the or the grain of salt I want everyone to take. So what I want to do is examine a number of animals, quite a few little case studies here, animals that were truly mysterious, that were truly a cryptid at one time, and now they're more of a commonplace animal. So that's, I think, what we'll do for some of these next things. I don't have too many long text slides, but I have a couple where I think it's worthwhile. This is a quote. This is from a translation from the Journal of Hanno the Navigator, who was a 6th century Carthaginian sailor. This is what he had to say. He went on a pretty major journey. He said, sailing around the mountains for 2 days, we came to an immense expanse of sea beyond which, on the landward side, was a plain. During the night, we observed big and small fires everywhere, flaming up at intervals. taking on water there, we continued for 5 days along the coast until we reached a great bay, which, according to our translators, was the Horn of the West. There was a large island in it, and in it a lagoon like this, and which was salt like the sea, and on it another island. Here we disembarked. In daytime, we saw nothing but forest, and at the night, we noticed many fires alight, heard the sounds of flutes, the beating of cymbals and tom-toms, the shouts of a multitude. We grew afraid, for our diviners advised us to leave this island. So, as I mentioned, Hanno was a Carthaginian. So he comes from ancient Carthage, which is like modern-day Tunis in North Africa. And they were famous, these Phoenicians, for sailing around in, talking, 500 years BC. He was the first to sail outside of the Pillars of Hercules. So he went all the way outside of the Mediterranean, was sailing around Africa. Now, we don't know exactly where he went because all we have are these kind of fragments of copies of a translation of his diary. But sometimes he'll describe something like, oh, we saw one big single mountain. Well, there's only a couple of places where that's something he could have seen sailing along the coast of Africa. So let's read a little bit more in his journal. Sailing thence along the torrents of fire, we arrived after 3 days at a bay called the Horn of the South. In this gulf was an island resembling the first with a lagoon, within which was another island full of savages. Most of them were women with hairy bodies, and our interpreters called them X. They had a name for them. Although we chased them, we couldn't catch any males. They all escaped being good climbers who defended themselves with stones. However, we caught 3 women who refused to follow those who carried them off, biting and clawing. So we killed them, we flayed them, and brought their skins back to Carthage. We didn't sail any further because our provisions were running short. So what do you think these translators, they had a name for these hairy savages. They said the men were too hard to fight. There were women that they could capture. What do you think these might have been? Any guesses? Keeping in mind where he's gone on the coast of Africa, he's down in sub-Saharan Africa. Pretty close. Gorillas. You're right on that second guess. They said, the translator said, those are something we call gorillas. Now imagine, this is going to be the first of this kind of series. Imagine you are the first European to have seen a gorilla. And you've got to tell somebody else on the end of your trip what you saw. There's all these great images of, Hanno running in. He's the first person to describe one of these gorillas in writing. So it's the oldest writing that we have about them. And I really like this picture on the right. It's got some real like Planet of the Apes vibes there with throwing the rocks down on them. But, imagine you have run into a lowland gorilla and you have to describe that to someone who's never seen one before. Are they going to believe you in what you say you saw? Because that seems like that's pretty wild, right? And so there's, a female there that they would have been able to take some of the skins back to Carthage. Remember, this is 600 BC. Now, when we talk about describing to science, there are people like Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century, who was one of the first people to start categorizing animals in kind of a scientific and a systematic way that we think of today. That's where, the animals have we're all Homo sapiens, right? Everybody's got the genus and species, and they actually classify everything in a really organized way. So some of these animals that we're going to talk about today, when we say like, oh, they were unknown to science, just means that Western science, this European science, hadn't studied them. It doesn't mean that, local people, obviously the local translators in that instance, they're like, oh yeah, we know all about gorillas. But to a European, to that explorer, that was really a cryptid. And it's amazing to me how late it took to study gorillas. Jeffries Wyman here would add the gorilla, study it scientifically, a set of remains in the 1840s. That's really not very long ago when you think about it. And, you can kind of see, you put a gorilla skeleton next to a human skeleton, you can kind of see that there's got to be some relation there. They sure look pretty similar. Now, they were really interested. They had only had remains, but Western science had never observed a gorilla in its natural habitat, never seen a live one. And so they actually contract this adventurer, this guy named Paul de Chalou, who was a lecturer. There he is. He doesn't have a lot of slides. He just has the one he can stand in front of. But he actually went on this expedition to Africa to go capture a gorilla and bring it back to Europe, bring it back to the United States so people could see it. And he wrote a book about his travels in the 1850s. I like some of the woodcuts here. This is my first gorilla, and his natural instinct is to immediately blast it, right? He gets out his rifle and he goes hunting. But don't feel bad for this gorilla, because if you actually look at the next slide, the gorilla snapped the gun, bent it all up, killed one of the porters. Like, they're pretty scary. 600 pounds, that's not somebody you want to mess with. But just like Hanno back in 600 BC, they were able to capture a couple of female gorillas alive. I also include another couple pictures because almost every animal he describes, and he says immediately after seeing a new animal, hereto unknown to science, better shoot it. So he blasts a crocodile, blasts a jaguar or a leopard there. But there are different types of gorilla. Most of the gorillas that most of us are familiar with, or the most common type, are the lowland gorillas. That's usually what you can go see at like the Detroit Zoo, or you see them. There are just a lot more of them in existence. But there are a number of types of subspecies of gorilla, and this is what amazes me: is some of them, like we look at. I've got one more passage for you here. This is Friedrich Robert von Beringa. He's a German. So prior to World War One, there are big chunks of Africa, East Africa, that are a German colony. There's lots of Germans there. And he said this is a German officer, and he's outside in like Tanzania, and he says, from our campsite, we were able to watch a herd of big black monkeys who tried to climb the crest of the volcano. We succeeded in killing 2 of these animals. With a rumbling noise, they tumbled into a ravine, which had its opening in the northeasterly direction. After 5 hours of strenuous work, we succeeded in retrieving one of the animals using a rope. The big human-like male monkey of 1.5 meters in height and a weight of more than 200 pounds. His chest had no hair. His hands and feet were of enormous size. Unfortunately, I was unable to determine its type. Because of its size, it couldn't have been a chimpanzee or gorilla, and in any case, the presence of gorillas had not been established in the area around the lakes. These are the great African lakes. 1902. What he had discovered was the mountain gorilla. Again, this was the 20th century. That's really pretty recent before anyone had described a mountain gorilla. And they discovered there's this whole other species of gorilla that live in Africa. So this happens a lot. Here's a picture of some mountain gorillas, which I love when mountain gorillas like stand up because they are a little bit smaller than the lowland gorillas, but they're obviously way bigger than a chimp. And so they kind of hang out with, they've got these anti-poaching guards who hang out with like the troops of gorillas to make sure poachers don't. So that's so recent to me that some of these things will happen. And my next story, shifting gears, does sound kind of very familiar. Who recognizes this? Right? It's King Kong, right? So my next story actually is where we get the story of King Kong. If you go to, we're going to shift gears over to Indonesia. There's a little tiny island in Indonesia, and Indonesia was a Dutch colony. So the Dutch were occupying this area, and they heard lots of tales because there are tens of thousands of islands, and the Dutch didn't have like an outpost on every single one. It's kind of the big cities, the big areas. But there were all these reports that they were getting that one of their islands had a horrific monster on it, a giant man-eating lizard that would just rip people right in half. It's terrifying. Now, there's a couple of different types of people. Like if I hear about an island where there's a giant monster that eats people and rips them in half, no, thank you. Now I know which island not to go to. But for some people, they're going to say, I'm booking the next ticket. I want to go there. And that's what happened with Lieutenant Jacques Carl Henry von Steen van Hansburg, who is like the most Dutch name of all time. So he goes to this island and he finds one of these giant lizards. And he shoots it. This is in like the 1890s when he does. Any guesses about the name of this island? It should give you a pretty big clue what he found there. That was the Isle of Komodo. So he found the Komodo dragon. This is another instance where indigenous people said, oh yeah, Komodo dragons are real. We know about them. We avoid them. They're scary. They're big. But Europeans are like, oh, I don't know about this. We've heard that this giant man-eating monster. We're going to go investigate. Komodo dragons are absolutely real. And some of the really big ones, well, if you have a smaller person, you can easily see how one of those could eat some. And the real evidence comes from on islands, animals tend to get kind of a pygmy form. If you get boxed into a little tiny island, there's not a lot of resources there. Animals tend to get smaller over size. And so Komodo dragons may have gotten a little bit smaller because if you go back even, 5, 10,000 years, you can see some of their predecessors. You see something like this, it's pretty easy to see how that could eat something. And even 5 or 10,000 years ago, while there may not be a written record of it, better believe the oral tradition of if you're a caveman and you see one of your friends gets eaten by that, that's going to make it into your campfire story, and that's going to stick around for a really, really long time. Once again, there was an expedition. Von Hansbroek had killed a example, but a lot of the scientific community said, we want something alive. And by the 20th century, by right around 1900, the Smithsonian said, we want a live example for our zoo. They hired the guy named William Douglas Burden, who wrote a number of books about his adventures, a picture of him right up there, to go to the Isle of Komodo and capture them alive and bring them back. If you've ever been to the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., you can actually still see the exact Komodo dragons that he captured and brought them back alive. They only lived like 6 months because they didn't know how to take care of them, but he brought them back. And that was the whole story, as you might imagine, of going on this expedition to the South Pacific to capture a dangerous animal, bring it back alive. Well, that's what the story of King Kong is. You replace Komodo dragon with a giant gorilla, and that's where you get that story. Interestingly enough, Burden also basically invented the theme park. This is just kind of a little coda to that story, but Marineland is just south of Disney World. It goes back all the way to the 1930s. So a very fun and exciting story inspired by the tale of a real-life cryptid, the Komodo dragon. Now, sticking with the Pacific, this is a guy named John Hunter. He was a naval commander, as his portrait here suggests. He was with the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy in the 1780s were going all the way to Australia. Kind of the first time. Europeans had visited a few times, but you talk about the opposite side of the world from England is Australia, all the way around. And a trip to Australia might take you anywhere from 6 to 9 months of travel time. It's something we cannot even imagine today. The only thing I can compare it to is today it'd be like a journey to Mars, a multi-month trip. Every part of that's going to be planned. It's going to be very difficult. Everybody might not make it on this trip. So when Hunter went to Australia, they found a lot of new flora and fauna there, and he was sending lots of examples back to like the Royal Society to study all of these new animals. And he had sent a partially taxidermied version here. You can see this is an amphibious animal of the mole kind. He got into a lot of trouble for sending this back. Because when this arrived in Australia, crack open the cases, and they discover this thing. It's got like a beaver tail. It's got like the bill of a duck, but it's furry, kind of like a groundhog. And the Royal Society said, ha, 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 very funny. This was very difficult to bring here from Australia. This is not the time for a practical joke to like make up an animal like this and sew a couple different animals together. And he had to say, no, this is for real. This is unlike anything else they had ever seen in Europe before. What do you think he sent back? He sent back a duck-billed platypus. I don't think it wore a hat. But yeah, he sent back the duck-billed platypus, which is such an oddball animal when you think about it. The mammal kind of looks like a beaver, but it's also got these big, webbed paws. It's got the duck bill. It's so strange. Now, one of the things that I promise to do in my lectures, we look at a bunch of these examples. Anytime I have the opportunity, I will include the picture of a baby version because they're very cute. And some of the animals and some of the cryptids we look at are like very scary. So whenever we get a chance to see a baby duck-billed platypus, you better believe we're going to take that opportunity. And the weird thing about these babies is they come out of eggs. These are mammals that lay eggs. They're the only ones. That's such an oddball thing. They also have a barb in their back leg. They are venomous. They can inject you with a venom, but they are a mammal. And so they were so unlike anything else that was seen by science. But, you could easily make that claim of no mammals lay eggs until you discover something like the duck-billed platypus. And you have to say, well, there's like one exception, right? There's one, right? No mammals are venomous. Well, there's always this exception. That's the kind of weird thing. So sticking with Australia, this is a ship called the Batavia, 1628. This was a Dutch ship that had a very interesting trip to Australia. It could easily make its own whole lecture just on its own. But they wind up, there's a mutiny. They wind up running into bad weather. There's a cyclone. They crash. A bunch of them get stranded on an island. There's some light cannibalism. It's a story, man. But they wind up on this desert island, basically off the coast of Australia, and they only have one longboat. So they send a couple of the sailors, and these are a bunch of families that are living on this island. And they send the sailors to the mainland, go get food. And the sailors come back. This is what they have found. This is what shows up in their journal. They said, amongst these big trees, we found a monstrous beast with the head of a fox, the hands of a man, the tail of a monkey, that wonderful provision of nature, a bag in which to carry its young. Later on, this is another description of that same animal. There are large numbers of cats, which are creatures of miraculous form, as big as a hare, the head similar of a civet cat, four paws very short, about a finger long, whereon there were five small nails or small fingers, as an ape's forepaw, and with two hind legs are at least half an ell long. They run in the flat of the joint of the leg, so that they are not quick in running. The tail is very long, the same as a meerkat. And if they're going to eat, they sit on their hind legs and take their food with their forepaws and eat exactly the same as squirrels and apes do. What animal do you think they had found? So the clue is, a kangaroo is a really good guess. But the clue is, they say they're pretty small. What's like a kangaroo but smaller? A wallaby, right? So they don't find Rocco, but they find a wallaby. Now, the thing that's most interesting to me when you look at those quotes and you see this is that there were a bunch of Dutch sailors in the 1620s who land. They see this, and their first reaction is, that's a weird looking cat. Like, right. Well, they do immediately shoot some because they're very hungry. Because your alternative is like all the people on the island you just left. So, but yeah, they see this and they're like, it's such an odd animal to them that they have to describe it as a cat, where they're like, I don't know, it looks like nothing we've really ever seen before. You know, Captain Cook would come back to Australia in the 1770s on the other side. He's over on the east side. And they would be the first expedition to run into kangaroos and describe them. What I think is really neat, this is an excerpt from a map from the 1780s, and it's probably the first depiction of a kangaroo. And you look on this side, and you can see pretty clearly up in the top left there's a big stallion. In the top right, you got a camel. Bottom left, there's a lion. It's showing the animals of the world. But then you got this thing in the bottom right, and that's what's zoomed in over there. This is clearly what happens when you play like telephone. You've got somebody drawing something that they have never seen before. And somebody's like, yeah, it's got like a kind of like a long neck, but it's got a pouch. And it's got really like strong arms and legs. And so that is the first known depiction of a kangaroo. Again, if somebody had to just describe it to you and you've never seen one, that's what you're going to get, right? So, I mean, George Stubbs here in 1772 would actually draw a kangaroo or the kangaroo from life. So they would, of course, find kangaroos all over Australia. So unlike anything from Europe. And in fact, one of the weirdest things that they describe, some of the sailors say, yeah, while we're on shore, we're getting water or food. Every once in a while, one of the sailors gets into a fist fight with them. And I says, what do you mean you got into a fist fight? And it seems like a weird thing until you realize, like, oh, yeah, a kangaroo will fist fight you, and they will win, too. You know, they're very strong, very muscular. But the kangaroo falls into this category of it depends on who you ask. So for Europeans, for well over 100 years, they are this cryptid of like they've heard about them, they describe some of them. Nobody's ever seen a live one. They seem like nothing else. To the Aboriginal people who like, oh yeah, we like hunt kangaroo all the time. They're like a white-tailed deer. That's not that mysterious. We see them all the time. So it's a matter of perspective, right? And here's a picture of a baby wallaby, right? So even like a baby kangaroo, but even smaller. While we're still in Australia, I want to do a little thought experiment with you that I always find kind of interesting. There's a little island off the coast of Perth called Fremantle Island. It's just far enough away that animals can't really swim back and forth, so it's kind of on its own isolated ecosystem. And there's an animal on Fremantle Island called the quokka. Any of you ever heard of a quokka before? No take. That's fine. That actually works really well. I'm going to describe to you what I see as a quokka. And I want all of you to get a mental picture of a quokka. And we're going to compare that to what it actually looks like. Sound like a plan? All right, so this is an animal, I would describe it as, it's about the size of a groundhog. It has the ears of a bear. It has the forepaws of a squirrel. And it is the happiest animal that I've ever seen in my life. All right, so are you all picturing something in your mind? I'm going to show you one. Is this what you were picturing? Was this close to anybody what you were picturing or a little bit different, right? So the quokka truly is this small little animal, and the way their like mouth is built, they all look like they have this like huge smile, and they look kind of like a fake animal. If you didn't know this was real, I think a lot of people, if you just showed this to them and didn't tell them it was real, they might be like, what is this? This looks like an AI koala bear or something, right? But every time you see a picture of one of these quokkas, they have like no fear of humans either. They're the top of the food chain. So the island's very highly regulated. A lot of people go there as the whole thing is basically a nature preserve to protect these. So no invasive species come and upset that very delicate balance. Now, when we talk about cryptids, it's another one that comes up quite a bit. The unicorn, right? So this is a very interesting animal. It's kind of like a horse, great big horn. The unicorn shows up in places like it's the national animal of anybody know what country? Scotland. Yeah, Scottish national animal is like questionably a real animal or not, right? What is the deal with a unicorn? Well, there's all sorts of different kind of theories about where this idea of the unicorn has come from, but there are a couple of animals that are a pretty real variant of a unicorn. Now, the first thing I want to show you, this is absolutely real. It's one of my favorite slides. So when you find a skeleton, you find a fossil, right? When we think about finding a fossil, if you're really, really, really lucky, let's think about like Sue the dinosaur, like the whole T-Rex, right? And they found almost all of it. That's why that is worth like 50 or 60 million dollars. It's super valuable because most times you find a fossil, you find a couple of bones. You do not find the whole creature. You don't find all of it at all. It might be kind of spread out over. It's been millions of years, and who knows how that animal died. So in the early part of the 18th century, like 1710, there were some Germans who were digging in a coal mine in Germany, and they found some fossilized bones. They brought them up, and they recognized them as bones. And they're like, well, this is from some kind of weird animal. Let's try and put it like back together. It's kind of a natural, like a puzzle. The problem is they like didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. You can't know that you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. So this may be kind of silly, and I can't fault them a whole lot, but this is what they came up with when they found a couple sets of bones. I would love to see this as a real animal because it's just like two legs that stomp around and a big skull with a horn and a tail. I don't know how this works, but I wish it would, right? So these are parts of actually a woolly rhinoceros, which went extinct about 50,000 years ago in Europe, like the time when like the mammoths die out. The woolly rhinoceros was one of these other giant animals that kind of died at the very end of the ice age. And so some of those bones survived, and they were trying to put that back together into what could that be. Same kind of thing, Marco Polo would describe a rhinoceros. And if you basically said like, oh, it's like a unicorn, but it's got armor on, that's what a rhinoceros is, right? There's another older example as well. This is a version. This is from a Roman mosaic in North Africa. Like, well, that sure looks like what I'd describe a unicorn. That's right. It looks like a horse with a big horn. Well, there was reports of this kind of creature in sub-Saharan Africa that went to, this is Sir Henry Hamilton Johnston, who was living in the latter part of the 19th century, and he's like the most British man to ever live. Like there's a picture of him at his dinnerware and his safari gear, right? So they had reports of this creature, this unicorn that he wanted to go and find. They said, it's 5 foot tall, 8 foot long, the legs of a zebra, body covered in reddish brown hair, a dark tongue like a giraffe, and cloven hooves. And he'd even gotten these 2 tanned strips of hide. And he sent them back to the Royal Society, and he said, well, these kind of look like a zebra, but the stripes aren't like going the right way with the hide. And they said, yeah, this isn't a zebra. This is something else. A little bit later on, he got a skull, something he'd never seen before. He said, well, what is that? And he said, well, okay, there are 2 horns there, but it's easy to see how it looks like one from the side. And the placement of those horns kind of coming out of the middle of the head rather than like the top. And so as he ventured in with some indigenous guides, lo and behold, he discovered the okapi. So the okapi is exactly like what they described. It's got the back legs of a zebra, kind of looks like a giraffe. It's about 5 feet tall. It's got that reddish tongue. They're very closely related to a giraffe, and there's one of those giraffe tongues. And so they are definitely a real animal, and you can definitely see how those ones with the horn look a little bit like a unicorn. As promised, there's a baby okapi. Pretty cute, right? So a lot of these things we've been talking about have been in the 19th century. These don't all happen in the past. I want to take you to a time that was not that long ago. 1996. This is an era where Pokemon come make their way to the United States for the first time. They're kind of like cryptids, right? So in 1996, the place is the Cerdamon Range, and this is one of the most inaccessible places on planet Earth. It's right up there with like the North Pole and the South Pole. There's a very tall mountain range in the middle of Papua New Guinea. So you have to go through like the world's densest jungle and then some of the world's steepest mountains right in the middle of this island, right on the equator. It's very inhospitable. But Papua New Guinea has thousands of different ethnic groups on the island, hundreds of different languages. It's one of the most culturally diverse places on Earth. Almost all of them share a story of the Bandagizi Mibaso, the man of the forest. And if we've learned one thing, if a bunch of indigenous people say, this is a thing that's real, that is out in the woods, and Europeans say, well, I don't know that, who ends up being right more often than not? And so Tim Flannery there, he's an American, he actually said, well, I'm going to go out and investigate this. Like, what is this man of the forest? And in 1996, he found a picture, he took a picture and discovered an entire new branch of mammals that no one knew existed before 1996, except for all of those islanders who said, this is definitely real. But it's that Western science that we had no idea. And so what he found was the dingisu. This was actually a type of furry kangaroo. And you can kind of see that in the one that's standing there, but they're incredibly rare. Basically, they've only ever been captured on film there in that very inaccessible place. So just because it's hard to get to, hard to find, that those pop up. There's a HD picture of one really up close and personal. They don't come out a lot that day. So this can happen even today. As late as 1996, they're finding like a large mammal that science said didn't exist before them. Right. Yes. Tim Flannery, to my knowledge, did not blast any of the dingisu. So we've come so far. Now, shifting gears again, we've talked a lot about land animals. Now I want to talk about, there's a lot of waterborne cryptids, like the kraken, right? So kraken's this giant monster can reach up, pull down an entire ship. Here's maybe a little bit more reasonable depiction. It's a giant squid attacking a yawl with two guys in it. Giant squid are definitely a real creature. And people kind of knew that they were real. This kraken giant squid distinction, because every once in a while, one would wash up on shore. The problem is when one of these squids would wash up on shore, they kind of like turn into jelly. They don't hold their form. Water animals don't do well on land outside of the water. I love this particular image because this like sailor and his friend here has no interest, and he's kind of just like, ooh, yeah, it's gross, bent right over it. I'm sure it smells great, right? But the giant squid, when we say giant, is truly unimaginably large. And again, you look at one on like a table like this is kind of all deflated. To give you an idea, if you stretch one out, there's for scale, one of these giant squid is the same length as three 1992 Lincoln Town Car Jack Nicklaus editions. That's over 60 feet of luxury automobile. And that's just how big that squid is. That's like the size of this room. Hard to imagine how big that is. They routinely attack things like sperm whales. There's another one that you can see. They have to kind of double up the legs on that one, or the tentacles, I should say. They had found pieces of sperm whale covered in sucker wounds from battles with these giant squid. And every once in a while, one of the sperm whales will wash up and they've got all these like claw marks on it. And that's probably from the beak of this giant squid as they would bite at each other, kind of like these two giant titans that fight underwater. But the thing is, the giant squid is so deep in the water. You look at one of these, they actually have the largest eye of any animal on Earth, the size of a dinner plate, because they live in the aphotic zone. That means just like no light is getting down to them 3,000 feet down, 1,000 meters. It's an incredibly deep depth. And so capturing one alive is kind of out of the question. They can't really come up. You have to go to them. And so there have been recently a couple of expeditions to go down and find one. And this, from I think like 2005 or 6, the very first footage of one alive in its natural habitat. I don't know about you, but if I was in a submarine and I looked out my window with my camcorder and I see this and it's 60 feet long, you better believe I'd be on that radio saying, we're going back up, pull me up. We're done down here. Because this is just what we know about, what we don't know in the depths there can be very scary. Enormous squids like this that show up all the time. It's easy to see how stories can come up of these attacking ships. And in an era where a lot of ships might just disappear or sink and you have no idea what happened to them, and then you see one of these wash up, easy to see how those stories get spread. As promised, because I know this is a little bit grosser than some of the big land animals, Not all giant squids, or not all squids are giant. There's a little baby squid up right on your finger. Right? So the sea serpent. This is another one of these sea creatures. The sea serpent, like a long lizard-like thing out in the water that could attack a ship. Here's actually a pretty accurate depiction from 1860 in a wood carving. The great sea serpent found in Hungary Bay, Bermuda, in 1860. Well, that's pretty simple to actually explain this one because that is an oarfish. And the oarfish is one of these incredibly long fishes, just like this, that they go out and capture. And, they don't really attack people or ships, but you can imagine if you were a sailor and you saw one of these, it kind of freaks you out if it might be as long as your boat or something like that. You're like, whoa, I don't want to tangle with that. How some of those tails come out of that. The oarfish actually starts out about the size of your palm, so they grow quite a bit. And one of those other sea creatures that this is my version that I grew up with, that sometimes people talk about, is mermaids, right? Mermaids. There are stories that go back to like ancient Syria. One of their gods of the sea was half man, half fish. And so it's nice to see the mermaid kind of bent like that. There are, medieval depictions of like the sirens and things like that, and some kind of impish, almost evil creatures that are part fish. This next one is actually a woodcut from the 1630s, and it is my favorite depiction of a mermaid that I've ever seen. This mermaid has like legs and feet, which most mermaids usually don't. But it's kind of open to interpretation, right? Everybody sees something a little bit different. Also, the limbs on that mermaid are very long, so very interesting. But as late as the 18th century, every once in a while they'll include scientific illustration, like here are some of the creatures you can find in the Caribbean. They'll include real different types of fish, things like the sawfish there, and also mermaids. They definitely live in the Caribbean. It's just presented as a fact. There's kind of two types of mermaids. There's like the Fiji mermaid. This is a really small mermaid. This is a very famous example of actually a hoax, a very famous hoax by P.T. Barnum, guy from the circus. He was played by Wolverine there in his musical. They didn't bring this up a lot, but he actually, what he did was he took a fish and he took like a mummified little monkey and sewed them together and showed it off. And this is an era before like anybody has a computer or a TV. You might be shuttled through a dark room and shown like this. It's like, whoa, that's kind of scary looking, and also it's right there. It's got to be real, right? Well, this was a fake, and P.T. Barnum basically admitted as much, although he did say, suckers born every minute. But this is a little bit different than that other type of mermaid that goes back to this much longer story. And there's a lot of mariners who claim to have seen mermaids that were kind of full scale. Christopher Columbus, in fact, says that he saw a mermaid on his 1493 expedition. He said, this is what he said about the mermaid. He said, they are not as beautiful as they are painted, since in some ways they have a face like a man. Well, what Christopher Columbus saw was a manatee. So I'm very interested in his journal when he's like, yeah, in some ways that has the face of a man. Yes, you saw a manatee. It doesn't really look like a person, but you imagine you seeing one of these in the water. You're seeing it through the water's maybe cloudy. It's got a lot of sand. Maybe there's seaweed all over. And these sailors are pretty lonely and they've been pretty bored at sea for a very, very long time. So there are a number of species of both manatee and dugong. So the difference between a manatee and a dugong, manatees have kind of a round fan tail, and a dugong has a bifurcated tail. So it looks like a whale. There's a dugong there on the very bottom. And there was another type of manatee dugong called Steller's sea cow. And these existed in the waters around Japan, and they were enormous. This is to scale. So if you think about the size of a manatee up there in the upper left, that's the size of Steller's sea cow. And so it's also not surprising. This lived in the waters of Japan. Japan had their own version of the mermaid in their story. So they're seeing these, eat along the water. They're kind of obscured. So easy to see where these stories come. As promised, here's a baby manatee. Pretty cute, right? So another waterborne cryptid, one of the most famous ones, Nessie. Now, there's a lot you could say about Nessie specifically, but one thing that I want to address is there's this widespread belief that Nessie might be a dinosaur, what remnants of a dinosaur that's left over. And so people have suggested that Nessie is a plesiosaur. They found skeletons of a plesiosaur and they're fossils of a plesiosaur. It kind of matched what a lot of people thought they were seeing, but it might be putting the cart before the horse, causation and correlation there. Plesiosaur are basically a lot smaller than a lot of people think. I think most of us, when we picture Nessie, I always picture something a lot bigger than this. Now, this is, do not get me wrong. I do not want to like fight one of these in a swimming. If I see one of these in a pond, I'm not swimming in that pond. But a plesiosaur is always a little bit smaller than I had kind of thought. But paleontologists are having to work with just what they can find, the fossilized remains. And so their interpretation of how those fossilized remains work have changed pretty drastically over the years. In fact, it was in the 1860s that they said it was that swan-like neck that's coincidentally what a lot of people said they thought Nessie looked like. And today, that's not what a plesiosaur probably looked like. Again, they just have the fossilized remains to go with. So leaves a lot of open to mystery. I'll give you an example for that. The King of Sweden in the 17th century had a pet lion that had been sent to him. He kept it as this royal symbol. And the lion died, and he sent it off to a taxidermist. He said, I want to have this stuffed so it can be in my throne room. And he sent the lion, an animal that lots of people knew what they looked like. They had seen one alive, and the taxidermist still came back with this. So, like, A for effort, right? But that should just tell you how hard it is to imagine, if you even have something like the skin, what you do. You see, like, a horrific creature like this. Like, what horrible dinosaur monster is this thing? Well, that's actually the skull of a hippopotamus. And it's really hard to tell that from just the skeleton. Same thing, here's a little, scurry creature like a mink or an otter or something, but actually that is an iguana. How do you know if it has fur versus scales? Like, you can't tell if that's completely gone. All you have is the bone. You see something like this. I've seen an artist rendition of this thing that looks truly alien based on those bones, but that is actually the baboon. You can't tell some of those details. So some of the fossils they've had to work with. This is kind of an interesting category of cryptids. This is a fossil called a coelacanth. And the coelacanth was a fish, pretty obviously here, that showed up in the fossil record, studied by a guy named Louis Agassiz, who's pretty famous in the 19th century. And the coelacanth became really interesting as this possible like missing link between land animals and water animals. And Agassiz would actually found the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, where they keep millions of specimens of all different kinds of animals, and they try and link them together to see how they're related. Well, the coelacanth fossils basically disappear from the record about 65 million years ago. You know what else happened 65 million years ago? Asteroid hit the Earth. Again, causation, correlation, exactly what's going on. Sometimes it's easier than other times when you realize an asteroid hit the Earth and then all the dinosaurs died like the next year. What you think probably killed them, right? So, and when the coelacanth disappears at the same time, they figure, well, that was an interesting little blip in history. Until 1938, when a number of sailors on a fishing ship off the coast of South Africa dig up a weird-looking fish in their nets. And they bring it back in. Marjorie Courtney Latimer worked at the local museum. They said, we don't know what this fish is. It tasted really bad. One of us tried to eat it. We'd never seen a fish like this before. It was really oily and gross. And she said, well, this can't be. This is a fish that's been extinct for 65 million years. And she, has it preserved as best they can. It's kind of treated as a one-off weird oddity. They looked for another one, but World War II happened shortly thereafterwards. It wasn't until 1952 when, lo and behold, another one of these was pulled up off the coast of South Africa, and they had confirmed for sure that was a coelacanth, an animal that had been dead to science for tens of millions of years, was contentedly swimming around the ocean, just waiting for somebody to drop a net in the right place. The coelacanth, you're actually all kind of familiar with the coelacanth, even if you don't think that you are. When they found this in 1952, it made international news. It was kind of a big deal. They were making a brand new movie at the time about a certain creature from a certain Black Lagoon. And when they said, well, we need the makeup, they said, oh, based on that coelacanth, that looks like ancient and weird. And so the creature from Black Lagoon is based on the coelacanth. You can see another one. They have brought up specimens for that, and they have even gone down and dived, and they found real ones. Some of them are pretty big. They found a couple different species of coelacanth. They just moved to a different area in deeper waters, and they didn't fossilize. So they disappeared from the fossil record. It didn't mean they disappeared from Earth, but it was this very kind of mysterious creature. So there's a few others that might fall into this category. In New Zealand, they talk a lot about the moa. The moa was one of the largest flightless birds anywhere on Earth. They say that the early people to move into New Zealand 1,000 years ago hunted the moa to extinction. Every once in a while, there's a report, somebody says, I think I saw a moa. who's to say they're all actually extinct? The Tasmanian devil, probably a creature you've heard of, at least in cartoon form. Here's a picture of, I think they're kind of cute, right? They seem, here's a baby Tasmanian devil. It was very cute. But then you realize they get that name because they're kind of mean. And when they're like this, you can see why they'd be called a Tasmanian devil. There's another animal from Tasmania. When you think about the Tasmanian devil, there's the Tasmanian tiger. This is a creature that's like halfway between big cat and wild dog, somewhere in between. It's its own thing. And they were definitely a well-known animal. They even had some at zoos, but very sadly, as far as science is concerned, the last one was shot in 1932, and they went extinct nearly 90 years ago. Earlier this spring, there was a guy in Tasmania who had his trail cam out, and he caught this on his trail cam. And there've always been lots of reports. People say, I think I saw a Tasmanian tiger. No, they're extinct. They're gone. But are you really sure you got them all? All it takes is a single one to disprove that idea that they're completely extinct. So I want to wrap things up by talking about probably the most famous cryptid of all time, or at least give you an idea about one cryptid that I definitely think is out there. We don't have proof for it yet, but I think it's coming. It's not necessarily Bigfoot. So there's Bigfoot, very, very famous as a giant primate. There are large primates all around the world. The orangutan actually means like man of the forest. They're very people-like in their appearance. I like this orangutan hanging out with the very stylish sunglasses here, or this little kid orangutan standing there, looks very sad for some reason. But the specific type of large primate cryptid that I think is absolutely real is the abominable snowman, the Yeti, right? It's not, Bumbles here. The term abominable snowman actually comes from 1921 from a British Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition. They were up in the Himalayas. And lots of people in the Himalayas have claimed to have seen some kind of large primate that's living up in the Himalayas. See it run off in the distance. Think about the Himalayas. The Himalayas are very difficult for us as a species to live in. There's not enough oxygen for our brains to work right. That's why a couple of people, I think, have climbed Mount Everest without oxygen, but very few. Most people, you got to breathe after that certain height. There's just not enough in the air. So your brain starts playing tricks on you. But that's not to suggest that there aren't other animals who might be more well adapted to that low oxygen air. Animals adapt to almost all places on Earth. And so they found lots of things like footprints, circumstantial evidence. Frank Smythe found these in 1937. Said, I didn't make these footprints. He took a picture of them going off into the snow. There's another set of footprints taken in the snow, and these were taken actually in 2019. These are from the Indian Army's Twitter page. They send some of their elite forces up to the India-China border, which is up in the mountains there. They're not the kind of people who are going to put out something ridiculous, right? Like, it's the Army. They're pretty serious people. So if they say, hey, we found weird footprints, I would be inclined to believe them and not think that they're just, having a go at it, right? Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, the first two guys to successfully climb Mount Everest and make it back down alive, they said they saw a Yeti. They said they saw that on their expedition. In Bhutan, this is, a cultural thing. They put the Yeti on their stamps. The indigenous people of the Himalayas say, oh yeah, Yetis are real. They're up there for sure. How many times have we heard that in this presentation alone, where a local indigenous population says, well, that's real, and Europeans who say, well, we'll have to see about that. I don't think so. Until one day they find one, right? Until they go out and blast one, they don't believe that it's real. So there have been some explanations. There have been explanations of giant polar bear that's misplaced. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I do lend a lot of credence towards this kind of misplaced giant primate. For example, there are other types of primates. We think about Homo sapiens, right? There are other Homo, other very closely related to us as large apes. Even Homo florensis they found. It's been called Hobbit man. Homo florensis has been found on the Isle of Florensis down in Indonesia. And they call it sometimes Hobbit man because like 2/3 our size, kind of a smaller version of a primate, very similar to us. And it's been a recent find, like 2003 is when they found the first of that evidence. And they said they were living on that island as recently as like 50,000 years ago. Not that long ago on a geologic timescale. This isn't ancient times. people, modern humans, were alive at the same time as this other primate. Same kind of thing with Gigantopithecus blacki, which was the largest primate we've ever known to exist. It's like a giant version of orangutan. There's a skull of one next to a human skull. Enormous and especially adapted for its habitat in like Indonesia, Malaysia, that area in the jungle. So who's to say that there is not a primate that is specially adapted for the Himalayas? People often talk about, well, why, do we not see them or something like that? Well, again, people, we don't exist up there. This is one of the reasons that I'm a little bit more skeptical of Bigfoot. Because I think if Bigfoot was out there in a temperate forest, the people who always report Bigfoot are usually hunters. One of them would have shot Bigfoot by now, right? If they're out there, there's a lot of people in a place where it's comfortable for us to exist. But you get up in those Himalayas, there's not a lot of humans out there hanging out. You have to be specially prepared to be in that environment. But that's not to say all primates are built the same way. So the last piece of evidence I want to leave you with is another picture taken from 1952 by a guy named Eric Shipton. I think it's a very powerful piece of evidence. I sure don't have an explanation for it. And I want to remind you where we started on. That all it takes is a single black swan to disprove the notion that all swans are alike. All it's going to take is a single Yeti to prove one day, oh, yeah, no, they are real. So is this going to be, our black swan? Is this going to be the proof that it takes? It might just be one day that comes along and somebody's finally able to get one on film or capture one in real life. And then we're going to say, oh, yeah, no, that was real the whole time, like we've seen happen so many other times. 1952, Eric Shipton was climbing up in the Himalayas, and he walked out of his tent one morning. He found a set of footprints outside of his tent that certainly weren't his. And he said, that's pretty weird, and took a picture of that. I don't have another explanation. Do you? So again, my name is Andrew Kercher. I hope that you enjoyed this. If anybody was, highly skeptical, I hope that maybe I gave you at least, a grain of salt to think about. Maybe I should keep an open mind about these sorts of things. I think they are so interesting. But if anybody does have any questions, my email address is right there, andrew.l.kercher@gmail.com. Happy to take questions in person here too. And my website is kercher.info, and that has all of my other talks, my upcoming schedule. So where I'm going to be, these are just a few of the different talks that I do. So if you enjoyed this today, please feel free to let your local librarian know. For those especially watching maybe online, I love traveling all over the state of Michigan, so you can always request me. And if you didn't enjoy it, well, the Tigers are playing. You could go turn that on right now. So, but thank you so much for letting me come out and talk to you guys tonight. Somewhat, yeah. I am from Port Huron, is where I am based out of, and so I speak in mostly Southeast Michigan, but I've gone all over the state. Ooh, yeah, that's right. Well, do I have anybody convinced? Is there anybody who's now maybe a little less skeptical?